In 1598, 140,000 Japanese soldiers were stranded on the Korean peninsula. Their commander dead in Japan, their supply lines cut, their navy shattered. What made the man who unified Japan send his entire army to die overseas?
He unified Japan in a decade. Then he sent 160,000 soldiers to conquer China through Korea. How did Japan's most unstoppable warlord engineer his own empire's collapse?
By 1591, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had accomplished something no Japanese warlord before him had ever achieved: the complete unification of the country. Born a peasant, he had risen through sheer brilliance, first as Oda Nobunaga's sandal-bearer, then as his greatest general, then as the man who outmaneuvered every rival after Nobunaga's death. Japan was at peace. Its armies, veterans of decades of civil war, were the finest fighting force in Asia. Hideyoshi had every reason to be satisfied. He was not. Hideyoshi's ambition did not stop at the water's edge. He told his allies and his diary that he planned to conquer Korea, then use it as a bridge to invade Ming China itself, the most powerful empire on earth. From there, he spoke of advancing further still. Whether these were genuine military plans or the grandiose fantasies of an aging ruler desperate for legacy, no one could say for certain. What everyone could say was that Hideyoshi meant to try, and that after 30 years of war, he had the army to attempt it. In April 1592, the invasion began. Some 160,000 Japanese troops, carrying the arquebus firearms that had transformed warfare during the civil wars, crossed the Korea Strait and landed at Busan. The Korean military, unprepared and divided, collapsed almost immediately. The Japanese army advanced at a speed that shocked even its own commanders. Busan fell in hours. Cheongju fell within weeks. The Korean king abandoned Seoul and fled north toward the Chinese border. By early June, less than 3 weeks after the landing, Japan had captured the Korean capital. The momentum seemed unstoppable. Japanese columns fanned out across the Korean peninsula, pushing north toward the Yalu River that marked the border with China. Japanese generals competed for the honor of leading the advance. Korean resistance, where it appeared, was crushed. But the rapid conquest concealed a dangerous vulnerability. Japan could win battles on land, but its supply lines ran across hundreds of miles of sea from home. And in the waters off the Korean coast, something was waiting that Japan's generals had not planned for. That something was Admiral Yi Sun-sin, commander of the Korean Navy. While Japanese armies swept through the peninsula, Yi was systematically destroying Japan's fleet, and with it, the supply lines the invasion depended on. His weapon was a revolutionary class of warship, the Gyobuk-sun, or turtle ship, iron-plated, bristling with cannon, nearly impossible to board. In engagement after engagement, Yi's outnumbered fleet defeated the Japanese Navy, By midsummer 1592, the Japanese advance in the north had stalled. Not because Korea stopped them on land, but because Japan could no longer reliably feed its armies.
The crisis deepened in late 1592 when Ming China decided it could not allow Japan to overrun its Korean tributary state. A Chinese army crossed the Yalu River and pushed the Japanese back south, away from Pyongyang and toward the peninsula's center. Hideyoshi's forces, already stretched across a hostile country and cut off by sea, now faced a new opponent. One with resources that dwarfed anything Japan could sustain across the water. The war that had begun with such terrifying speed had ground to a halt. Both sides would spend the next 3 years pretending to negotiate. From 1593, both sides entered peace negotiations, a process that would drag on for 3 years and ultimately collapse in spectacular failure. Japanese negotiators, under orders to demand that Hideyoshi be recognized as equal sovereign of Asia, secretly concealed those terms from the Chinese. The Ming, in turn, prepared documents naming Hideyoshi merely King of Japan, a subordinate vassal title that fell catastrophically short of what Hideyoshi had demanded. When the Ming envoy finally arrived in Osaka in 1596 with the papers, Hideyoshi read them, and the war's clock started again.
The envoy's arrival was a disaster. The documents the Chinese presented were fundamentally different from what Japan's negotiators had promised. Where Hideyoshi had expected acknowledgement as supreme lord of a new Asian order, the Ming offered a subordinate title, a symbolic vassal relationship, and not a single one of his territorial demands. Japan's own diplomats, who had quietly agreed to Chinese terms without authorization, had deceived their master for 3 years. Hideyoshi, reportedly shaking with rage, expelled the Chinese delegation from his palace. The negotiations collapsed overnight. The second invasion would follow within months.
In January 1597, Hideyoshi launched the second invasion with an army of 140,000 men. This time, Korea was ready. The years of uneasy truce had been spent building new fortifications and training new armies. And Admiral Yi Sun-sin was waiting again, though barely. Yi had been dismissed on fabricated charges during the peace period, nearly executed, and reduced to the rank of common soldier. Now, with the second invasion underway, and Japan's navy threatening to dominate the seas once more, the desperate Korean command made the only logical decision: restore Yi Sun-sin to command.
Yi returned to a navy that had been almost entirely destroyed in his absence. Only 13 ships remained seaworthy. At the Battle of Myeongyang in October 1597, facing a Japanese fleet of over 100 vessels in narrow straits, Yi used the geography and the current to neutralize Japan's numerical advantage. By the end of the battle, 31 Japanese ships had been sunk or disabled. Yi lost none. It was one of the most extraordinary naval victories in recorded history. The second invasion, like the first, could not hold its supply lines. Japan was winning on land and losing the war.
Then, in September 1598, everything changed. Not on the battlefield in Korea, but in Japan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi died at Fushimi Castle, aged around 62, after a prolonged illness. His son and heir was only 5 years old. Among Hideyoshi's final recorded words was a desperate plea to his generals: bring the army home safely and protect his child. The Council of Regents he had appointed to rule until his heir came of age had already begun maneuvering for power before the body was cold. The war in Korea, already failing, had suddenly lost its reason for existing.
The withdrawal from Korea was a catastrophe in its own right. Japanese commanders, under pressure to get their armies out before winter set in, arranged truces and in many cases broke them. Korean and Chinese forces, sensing the collapse, attacked the retreating columns. The final sea battle of the war at Noryang in November 1598 saw a joint Korean-Chinese fleet intercept the Japanese navy attempting to cover the retreat. Admiral Yi, who had spent 6 years defeating Japan at sea, was killed by a stray bullet in the very moment of his final victory, dying as the war he had defined finally ended.
The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate hundreds of thousands of Koreans died, soldiers and civilians alike, while the peninsula's cities, temples, and cultural treasures were destroyed. Japan lost tens of thousands to battle, disease, and brutal winters. Among the most disturbing practices of the war, Japanese commanders, under pressure from Hideyoshi to prove their progress, sent back hundreds of thousands of noses and ears cut from Korean and Chinese dead as a macabre body count. The practice is still commemorated in Kyoto today at Mimizuka, the Mound of Ears, a monument to one of history's most grotesque accounting methods.
Back in Japan, the war's failure immediately reshaped the political landscape. Hideyoshi had spent Japan's military strength and financial reserves on a catastrophic foreign adventure, and left behind only a 5-year-old heir and a council of regents barely pretending to cooperate. Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had not been sent to Korea and had spent those years conserving both his army and his wealth, while Hideyoshi's loyalists were bled dry overseas, moved quickly to consolidate influence. The seeds of the Battle of Sekigahara, which would decide Japan's next 300 years just 2 years later, were sown in the mud of Korea.
The veterans who returned from Korea were not the same men who had crossed the strait in 1592. Many came back bringing Korean artisans, potters, and scholars, taken captive and transported to Japan, where their work would transform Japanese ceramics and printing technology for generations. The Korean invasions, a military catastrophe for Japan, accidentally accelerated a cultural exchange that reshaped Japanese art and industry. The ceramic traditions of Arita and Hagi, still celebrated today, trace their origins directly to Korean potters brought to Japan during those 7 years. Some historians call it Japan's Pottery War.
Historians still debate what Hideyoshi actually intended. Some see a leader who had run out of domestic enemies and needed a war to keep his restless veteran armies occupied. Civil War soldiers with no civil war to fight. Others see genuine strategic vision, an attempt to reshape the balance of power in East Asia before the other major powers could react. A third view holds that Hideyoshi, aging and perhaps losing his grip on reality, simply could not accept that his ambition had limits. Whatever the true motive, the result was the same. Japan spent its strength. Korea was devastated. And the Toyotomi dynasty he had built survived him by barely 2 years.
In Korea, the War of 1592 to 1598 is called the Imjin War, and it is remembered as one of the defining events in the nation's history, a trauma that shaped Korean identity for centuries. Admiral Yi remains the country's greatest national hero. In Japan, the same war is rarely discussed, absent from most school curricula, largely unknown to the general public, its sites unmarked and its victims uncommemorated. The asymmetry of memory is itself a historical fact. The perpetrator moved on. The victim did not forget. The scars left by those 7 years in Korea have never fully healed.
Hideyoshi's death left Japan's future uncertain, and one northern warlord saw an opportunity unlike any other. While the rest of Japan mourned and maneuvered for power, Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon of the north, was quietly planning the most audacious diplomatic gambit in samurai history. A secret mission to send a Japanese envoy all the way to Rome, to the Pope himself. What was Masamune really hoping to gain? And why has Japan almost entirely forgotten it happened?
The invasion of Korea remains one of the most consequential and least discussed chapters of samurai history. A war that devastated a peninsula, shattered Hideyoshi's dynasty, and handed Japan's future to the Tokugawa fates for the next 250 years. If you found this forgotten story of ambition and catastrophe compelling, subscribe for new Samurai Chronicles episodes every day. And tell us in the comments, was Hideyoshi a visionary who overreached, or simply a conqueror who ran out of enemies at home?